Jori Epstein, Frank Schwab, I'm Jason Fitz. It is time for Inside Coverage. Feeling good. This feels a good episode. Look, I'm just going to acknowledge this. I've had to acknowledge it on every show straight off of shaving my head. You know, Frank, I wanted to look more like Frank. I wanted to be more like Frank. But Jori, I left you time this morning. I mean, you could have, if you wanted to, you could have joined the Shave Head Club. We could have just like buzzed the whole thing off. We could have had a thing going, Jori.
I know I texted you guys before we got on being like, do I have too much hair to be on this podcast? Which is funny because I got a haircut a couple weeks ago and cut like 3 or 4 inches off. So I probably lost the most amount of hair just in straight volume, but you guys still have a lot less than I do. So thanks for letting me on, really diversifying our group in terms of like what our hairstyles look like.
The important thing to note is that I have to continually note this with Frank because Frank has gone cleanly bicked. It's a sign that Frank has no choice. Because I've gone peach fuzz all the way around, it's a sign that I'm making a conscious decision to eliminate my hair. Just want to make sure we're clear on that, Frank.
As Fitz has found out, though, life is so good as a bald dude because you just roll out of bed, you're ready. Like, that's it. Like, hey, hair's done. Let's go. It is. There's perks to this thing. I'm telling you. There's perks to being follically challenged. I can't lie to you.
Follically challenged. What an adverb.
I just feel like, too, I mean, I feel like I look tough now. I'm just, let's be honest. Like, this is the toughest.
I almost jumped off the Zoom. I was like, oh, my God. Like, I can't. This guy. It's Fitz.
Intimidation.
When I got my first sleeve tattoo, it was funny. I was walking through a parking lot of a grocery store down in Nashville, and literally I heard him, like a kid was staring because my sleeves are colorful, and I heard a mom say, stay away from the mean man with the tattoos. And I laughed about it because I was like, look, I got a tattoo and I became a mean man. Now I have a tattoo and a shaved head. Whew, I'm telling you, people run in the streets. Okay, I've delayed long enough from a topic that we have to get into. We got a lot to get into today, but the breaking news that everybody's talking about are the Antonio Pierce, are the Davante Adams trade rumors that are everywhere because Antonio Pierce liked to tweet that Davante might get traded. Davante went on with K Adams on Adams and Up and Adams and said he hadn't heard from coach, so he didn't know what the scoop was. Adam Schefter now has reported, quote, the Raiders have informed other teams they would consider trading wide receiver Davante Adams for a package that would include a second-round pick and additional compensation. Adding this morning, two teams high on Davante Adams' wish list of places to land, if not at the very top, are the Jets and the Saints, per league sources. So, Jori, I mean, before I give any of my thoughts on this as a fan that watches this all the time, I want your thoughts as our insider on where we are right now.
Yeah, I asked around the league, different people, just what are they expecting? It's funny. I asked someone, like, is there anything to this Davante Adams stuff? And they're like, my man is out of there. He's gone. So I definitely think that people expect this trade to go through. I think that on Davante's side, we've heard so much of this rumbling for years now. But now that it's really at this next level, you don't really take it to this level if you don't feel like there is a market for you. So any good agent would say, hey, like, let's ask around teams, make sure that someone is willing to do this before we really escalate it. There's definitely a belief around the league, as Adam Schefter reported this morning. People were talking to me about this yesterday, that he'd want to reunite with one of his former quarterbacks. He and Derek Carr go back to their Fresno State days. In addition to their time with the Raiders, he and Aaron Rodgers, obviously, with the Green Bay Packers, and Jets offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett was his offensive coordinator in Green Bay. I think those feel like lazy comps, but also that is what he wants. I think what's interesting to me is that, first of all, a team needs to need a receiver, ideally be somewhat of a contender, because if not, why are you bringing this guy in? Which I would say the Saints and Jets both are. And then also, like, I was going off about this before we started recording, but when people are like, the Cowboys are asking around, yeah, any team is going to like check in just so they've done their due diligence. It makes no sense for the Cowboys to bring in Davante Adams. They paid CeeDee Lamb $34 million a year, more than any non-quarterback who's not named Justin Jefferson. They don't need a pass help. They need someone who can stop the run and run. And that's not what Davante Adams does. In fact, as you guys know, he was saying, like, I'm getting hit too many times. So he's definitely not coming in wanting to run the ball all the time. So I just think that one was a little bit crazy, but I am interested in those. And the other kind of like dark horse I'm curious about is there are definitely people around the league who are speculating about Baltimore.
Baltimore would make sense. I'll keep doing this because I did it before with this team. The Detroit Lions should be all in. Like, why not? Like, hey, you want a second rounder? Okay, we don't care. We just want to chase this Super Bowl. Jameson Williams has been very, very good for them. But can you imagine Davante Adams taking snaps in that offense? All of a sudden, you go from being maybe the best offense in the league to we're talking about like 2007 Patriots type of stuff. I'm still interested. And also the fact that the Chiefs are apparently not even involved. I get it. Division rival. You don't want to do that. But maybe you hold your feet to the fire. And if the Chiefs come through and say, okay, everybody else is offering a second, we'll offer a first. I mean, you're the Chiefs. You are chasing this third Super Bowl title, and you need some help after Rashee Rice is out. We still don't know officially he's out for the season, but he's going to be out for a long time. I get it, though. That's not going to happen. Saints doesn't make any sense to me because Rashid Shaheed's awesome. Like, he's really, really good, and obviously they have Chris Olave. So I don't really see – look, any team's better with Davante Adams. I get that. I don't really see that being a big need for the Saints, though. Jets make sense, obviously. So, but I don't even know where the Jets season is going after that debacle on Sunday. So it's just weird to find a fit for the Raiders and Adams here, a trade partner. The one thing that really is confusing to me is why didn't this happen in March? Why is it happening now? Like, the Raiders are 2-2. They're certainly not bad. They're not an 0-4 team. You knew in March what this was going to be. Like, nothing has changed, and all of a sudden, both sides decide, oh, we're gonna trade Davante Adams. Did Davante Adams think this team was going to be 4-0 or something? Did the Raiders think that they needed Davante Adams, but now they don't anymore? Like, I don't know what could have changed. You could have gotten so much more for Davante Adams in March, I think, than you would get now. That's the confusing part to me. But I'm more curious to hear what Fitz has to say about all this, because this is his Raiders kind of making a weird trade after not a bad start to the season for them.
I know that this could come back to haunt me as a take, because it did. I said the night before Khalil Mack was traded that I thought there was 0% chance they would actually trade Khalil Mack, and they did. And my phone blew up the next day. But I want to bring Khalil Mack into this conversation because I don't think Davante Adams is going to get traded. I think what's happened here is the player has come in and said, I want out. And the organization says, all right, we'll put some feelers out. We'll kind of we'll see what's out there. But realistically, somebody's got to go to Mark Davis. The new administration has got to go to Mark Davis and say, hey, we're not good enough to compete, so we're going to get rid of our best player, and we're going to do it for draft picks. That is the exact sales pitch that John Gruden made when they got rid of Khalil Mack, who, by the way, has been kicking the Raiders' ass twice a year ever since. So now you got to go to an owner and say, sorry, we didn't do this in March for the new GM, Tom Telesco. You got to go to the owner and say, sorry, we've already spent all this money, but the best way we're going to get better is with a second-round draft pick and maybe some other stuff. If you tell me that they're going to get Garrett Wilson in return, sure, that trade makes a ton of sense. You're battling for the future. I understand that. That's not what this reality is. So I'm still looking at the sales pitch to an owner where you've got to go in and say, hey, the way we're going to get better is to give him to somebody else. That's why I absolutely don't think you can trade him to the Jets, because then you got to go to Mark Davis and explain why, as an organization, you weren't in on trying to get Aaron Rodgers in the first place. Instead, now you're sending Aaron Rodgers what he needs to get a Super Bowl. Like, you're going to send the Ravens, who you just beat a couple of weeks ago, now you're going to send them a key?
At all, or they didn't get him?
They were barely in on Aaron. They weren't in on Aaron enough to really be part of the Aaron Rodgers sweepstakes, right? Like, you're going to send him to Derek Carr after you let Derek Carr go to help Derek Carr win? Like, I just keep thinking about Mark Davis in the room for every one of these conversations, and I can't find a way it goes through. Everybody's told me I lost my mind, but if you're telling me a second-round pick, you're telling me that they're going to go to Max Crosby and be like, hey, man, I know yet again we're going to make life chaotic for you, and yet again we're going to suck, but we're going to get a second-round pick, which is typically a starting offensive lineman, so that we can hopefully try and get the ammunition to move up for a quarterback next year. Like, that's not a sales pitch to your stars, to your organization, or to your owner. I don't think it's happening.
I disagree with you about whether it's going to happen, but what I like is that you're factoring in the ego of the team owners, because I do think that that is a huge element here, which is one of the reasons why I think the Jets are a prime candidate, because Woody Johnson was the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. His team is going over to England this week to play on, I mean, I guess it's prime time, if you can call Sunday morning prime time. They'll be the only game on at that hour against a very good Minnesota Vikings team with a Brian Flores defense that is pretty likely to make the Jets offense continue to look as discombobulated as it is. And so it would not surprise me if, after being embarrassed in the country that he served as ambassador to. Woody Johnson's like, we need help. Get me a guy. And then, oh, okay, you're trying to convince Mark Davis? Well, I know of a pass rusher who is under contract with the Jets, but has not showed up in 6 months. Well, what if you can get Hassan Reddick to the Raiders? Then is that more palatable to Mark Davis? I do think the Garrett Wilson stuff is interesting. And I know that people were talking a lot about how he made comments this week on a podcast about his route tree not developing and not feeling like they figured out how to use him. I think that the compelling element of why they would send Garrett Wilson away is because Aaron Rodgers, for better and for worse, like, if you're in his corner, he's going to help you out. And if you're not, he probably won't. I still think, though, like, the comments were in response to a question about that on the podcast, and Garrett kind of went after the out of context taking of that context, and also, like, how much can you continue to completely mortgage your future and only give Aaron Rodgers the guys that you want. But I do think the Hassan Reddick for Davante Adams trade is very interesting, especially if you can get draft picks over to Las Vegas.
Now that team, real quick, I will say, Frank, if you're telling me that the Raiders get a building block back in exchange for Davante Adams, that's a much different conversation. Now it makes total sense. If you're telling me they're just getting draft picks to try and move up, that makes no sense to me.
What makes no sense to me is any Garrett Wilson talk. Like, what are we doing here? Garrett Wilson, Davante's awesome, right? And maybe he's better than Garrett Wilson. He's also about 8 or 9 years older? Like, what are we doing here? Like, that makes no sense to me. And what the Jets have to do is stop.
I thought you said 8 or 9 years old, not older. And I'm like, I think Davante's older than that.
What the Jets need to do is stop catering to Aaron Rodgers. That's what we need to do here. Like,
that's not happening.
Okay, we've given you everything, including a really, really bad offensive coordinator who Garrett Wilson rightfully ripped. Perform, Aaron. Like, no, we're not going to go get you Davante Adams and dig ourselves this hole even deeper. Go perform. Go do something. Like, you're supposed to be the guy here, and we've catered everything to you up to this point. I don't know. Like, if you somehow trade Garrett Wilson for Davante Adams, unless you're getting back from the Raiders like a second round pick, like, I'm serious. Like, it makes no sense to me. I can't even understand these rumors. So anyway, yes, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here. I don't know what's going to happen with Davante, but I think it would be hard for Mark Davis to be like, yeah, we're 2-2, but let's just punt again. Like, I don't know, like, why. And I don't know that Hassan Reddick coming off of his couch in October makes a lot of sense. And Garrett Wilson's not going to happen because that's the most bananas thing I've heard. I just don't know how any of this fits. I can't find a great fit for Davante Adams anywhere. Yes, the Ravens make a lot of sense, but is that really going to happen?
I actually don't think the Ravens make a lot of sense because Davante was going off about how he keeps getting hit all the time and essentially questions about the physicality interest in that game. And if he goes to the Ravens, he's going to have to be blocking downfield quite a bit for Derrick Henry and co.
Let me throw one other portion of this conversation out there that I don't think we're having enough of. This all really became a national story because Antonio Pierce liked to tweet and because Davante went out and said he hasn't heard from coach. How many missteps are we going to excuse from Antonio Pierce? At some point, number one, your coach probably just shouldn't be on Twitter. Number two, your coach sure as hell shouldn't be liking a tweet about one of the stars being traded. Number three, we shouldn't then find out on national TV that star has not since heard from the coach. At some point, I look around. Every broadcast, I'm reminded that Antonio Pierce brought in like 30 different assistant coaches, and every coach he's ever played for is on the staff to help him become a head coach. When are they going to help teach him to stop doing things head coaches aren't supposed to do? Like, how many missteps will we excuse from Antonio Pierce that are creating stories? Because players will tell you the one thing you never want to do as a player is create a question that has to be answered by other players in the locker room. If that's the case for players, you sure as hell as a coach shouldn't be creating questions that superstars have to answer. This is another inexcusable and immature moment from a head coach that's no longer an interim. It's no longer a cute story. Like, dude, you are the head coach of the Raiders. Act like it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, yeah, what are you doing? Like, how is this making anything better? And has some communicate. Like, yeah, Davante Adams shouldn't be saying, I haven't heard from coach. Like, what? Like, this it's probably a conversation that needs to happen, not through podcasts, right? Like, this is something that the two men need to sit down and handle. Yeah, the whole situation is just weird and sloppy from many, many angles. And I don't know how this resolves itself, really.
I mean, again, like, I'll go back to something C-Rob said last week. C-Rob said that sometimes former players, when they become coaches, aren't thinking long-term. They're thinking short-term. And that makes so much sense. It's just baked in my brain now when you think about Antonio Pierce. It's baked in my brain that you can look at that tweet And you can like a tweet, not even think about it. But when you're the head coach, you have to think about it. You can not reach out to Davante afterwards because you think, I'll just clear it up with him when I see him. And then these sort of things happen. Like, you have to have such a different perspective on how you handle everything you do when you're not just a guy in front of a microphone. You are the guy in front of a microphone, when everything that you do speaks for you, but also speaks for every one of the people that wears silver and black. Like, this is such a gross misstep to not have, especially after you went to a microphone and you said business decisions, and then you kind of had to walk that back the next week. Say, I should have talked to my team. Well, maybe now you should have talked to your player. And how many times are we going to let you say my bad before we all look at you and say, hey, dude, this is obviously your bad. Like, this is frustrating to me to see somebody that supposedly got the pulse of a locker room and that's why he's got the job, yet again, have a misstep in the locker room.
So I will say that I agree it takes some acclimation when guys become head coach or GM or something like that. And I shouldn't say guys, I should say people, because perhaps one day it will not only be guys. But I've definitely talked to general managers who have said stuff to me on the record, very clearly on the record, and then afterward be like, look, I don't disagree with what I told you, but I realize now I have to speak as the head coach / general manager of the organization, not for myself. And so I can't speak like that on the record. I think what I would ask you, though, is, okay, the business decisions comment that people slammed Antonio Pierce for, like, well, didn't they come back and play more physically the next week? Like, was that a misstep or did it work?
They came back and played more physically the next week, yes. Was that because of the business decisions conversation?
I mean, it didn't seem to hurt it.
I think, for me, two things. When you are the coach that's brought in to be the motivational guy and your team comes out flat, I'd like to know why, right? Like, so the inexcusable part of it was the way they played in the Carolina game. Also, when your locker room is telling reporters afterwards, yeah, it was good. We aired some things out that we needed to air out. And you're 3 games into a player's coach regime this year, like, what are you already airing out that has pissed you off so much that you need help after 3 games communicating as a team? So I think all of those, like, did they come out fired up because he said that, or did they come out fired up because they finally, like, he was doing what he was hired to do? There's a fine line for me.
And everybody looks a little better against the Browns offense. So
yeah, but I also feel like players coach or former player coach, because to me, a former player coach does have the ability to say things like that a little bit more than a non-coach. Because if it's a coach who hasn't played, they're like, what would you know about that? You don't understand how physical you have to be to play that game. Yeah. So I don't think that it was a bold move, but I don't think it backfired on him. Maybe to Davante Adams, but I don't think to the locker room as a whole. Like, I think people knew that's what Antonio Pierce felt. Maybe he just hadn't said it as publicly and externally before.
But if it backfired to Davante and they end up trading him for peas, I mean, if they get a bag of Skittles back for Davante at this point, they could have traded him for a lot more than that before the NFL draft with somebody that would actually, I think Frank's point, to wrap this, Frank's point at the beginning was an important one to remember too. If the Raiders trade him today, the real question is, what could they have gotten before the NFL draft for Davante? And could that player actually be helping them win football games right now? Like, could they have included Davante in some sort of a trade package that would help them have moved up to get somebody like Jaden Daniels instead of sitting here not having an idea what they're doing at the quarterback position? I don't know. We don't know. We'll never know. But man, I think that has to be part of this conversation. So,
or even like a Brian Thomas Jr. or, I mean, yeah, there'd be somebody helping them right now who's not going to be helping them until 2025.
Before we move completely away from the news of the day, there was one other big piece of news I think we should at least address. Von Miller suspended 4 games for violating the personal conduct policy. Some pretty awful allegations from him to the mistreatment of his pregnant girl back in November. The league finally acted on it. I should stress here, as I stress to fans all the time, whether or not criminal charges are brought is something the league has made very clear never matters to them. They do their own internal investigation. So at the end of their own internal investigation, they suspended him 4 games. I don't think, Jori, this was a surprise to most of us. Do you get any sense that people were surprised around the league?
No, I think this was definitely expected. It was interesting when Von had a great game on the field a couple weeks ago and was making some key plays. I believe it was against Jacksonville. People were like, I saw someone tweeting who I really respect, like, why don't we talk more about Von Miller? Like, we weren't talking about him this offseason and what he could do. And I was like, yeah, that's because of these allegations and because we knew that his status was in jeopardy, in addition to just like being uncomfortable talking about what he could do on the field, given what he was alleged to do off of it. I do think that, like, if you're the Bills, and again, football separate from the allegations, because the allegations are really awful. The 4 games now, like, this is a Bills team that's gotten a good start from a record standpoint to the season. I don't expect it to impact them into the playoffs, and I don't expect it to make the difference between whether they make the playoffs or not.
Yeah, football-wise, it's let's just talk about football because, yes, the allegations are terrible. Football-wise, it really hurts the Bills. I mean, he had...
Do you think it does really hurt them?
Yes, I think it... Over the next 4 games, like, I mean, we're talking about, like, you drop a couple games in there. He transformed their defense. I thought he was washed. I thought he was cooked. And all of a sudden, he comes back, and he looks like Von Miller again and really had an impact on them. And let's say you drop a couple of these games. All of a sudden, you're going on the road to Baltimore or wherever in January instead of being at home. It can make a big difference when you're talking about where the Bills want to go this season. So, yeah, he'll be back by the playoffs and the push before that. But I do think this could affect them. We'll see. We'll see how it looks the next few games. Part of the thing to me is just the NFL's inconsistency with all this. Like, why now? Why didn't this happen before the season? Why hasn't Rashee Rice happened? Why hasn't anything happened on Jordan Addison? But it did happen on Von Miller. It's just so inconsistent across the board. It's always just a weird look for the NFL whenever they get involved with this stuff.
Yeah, the Rashee Rice thing is interesting because I understand the investigations, but I'm also wondering as people talk about the degree to which he will be out because of his injury, is he going to be injured and then have to serve a suspension afterwards? Because it doesn't seem like he's going to get off scot-free. The NFL did also come out with Brandon McManus, the kicker, who Washington had released, and they said that there's not enough evidence for any kind of consequences from the league side there after he had been accused of various things on the team playing to London last year. Also interesting that they had that come out before the first overseas game. But I do think that some of this is about their ability, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, which the league does not always deserve, but if we are, then there's an element of like investigations are going to move at different time tables based on the information that they need to discover, based on their ability to contact people, things like that. So this isn't shocking, but in terms of the Bills, so he's going to miss Texans, Jets, Titans, and Seahawks. I would think the Bills should be able to win at least 2 of those without him.
Like,
probably
what if you lose to the Jets and all of a sudden there's the tiebreaker at the end and you lose the AFC East? Like, I'm not saying the Jets look like a potential division champion 4 days ago or whatever, but these are, I mean, this all does matter at the end when we're talking about, again, we're not talking about just whether to get into the playoffs, because surely they will, I assume anyway. But this is talking about like, hey, the Bills want to win a Super Bowl this year, and they've looked like that type of team through 4 games, and 1 loss, 2 losses that you maybe wouldn't have if Von Miller makes a big play. All of a sudden, that could come back and be like, oh, that was the difference. You know, all of a sudden, you're playing in Houston on divisional round weekend
you're
instead of playing
at
in Buffalo.
Arrowhead. You're playing
right,
at Arrowhead.
Arrowhead.
I mean, I know playing in Buffalo didn't help them last year, but playing at Arrowhead is a nightmare for this team.
And in most teams, actually. Yes. I think it matters. Von is, as a football player, he's looked like Von Miller, future Hall of Famer. And that has made a big, big difference in the Bills defense and why they've looked so good through the first 4 games of the season.
All right, speaking of looking good, there's a group of quarterbacks that are resurging into the league. Jori wrote about it. We'll talk about it when we come back. All right, Jori, quarterback resurgence is something you wrote about for Yahoo this week, and it's one of, I think, the best stories of the early portion of the NFL. It feels like some guys left on the trash heap are all of a sudden not only just playing well, but playing well enough that they're changing the way they're perceived entirely. Baker is obviously the first example of this, right? Like Baker, the way he's playing right now has everybody excited.
Absolutely. I was so interested in this because I think we spend so much time going into the draft talking about the inexact science of scouting quarterbacks. And we say, how do we know if a guy's going to be ready? How do we know once he gets there? But then we don't necessarily talk about what happens in year 2, 3, 4 of these really high draft pick careers. So Sam Darnold, top 3 pick. What happened with him in the Jets and was he able to recover? Baker Mayfield, number 1. I mean, we've seen a few different guys in this boat recently, and Baker Mayfield in particular. It's interesting because I think when you look at the Zach Wilson element, it's pretty easy to say that in a lot of ways the Jets failed him. They didn't give him the right pieces around him. They didn't really give him to succeed. I think I've mentioned on this podcast before that when you talk to talent evaluators around the league, whether it's GMs, personnel execs, I've talked to multiple in that category who have said, like, they didn't really stop thinking that Sam Darnold was capable. Now, there might be an element of, like, is he going to have the opportunity to come back? But people really did feel like Sam Darnold had the tools even after the Jets situation didn't work. And we're obviously obviously seeing some of that in Minnesota now, and after he got some time with Kyle Shanahan. Baker, on the other hand, like, it's a little bit of a lazy narrative to be like, the Cleveland Browns didn't give him the infrastructure to succeed, because I think they did. Like, they gave him a top 5 offensive line. He had Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, David Njoku was young but had that potential. He had a top running back, and yet he kind of was inconsistent. He also didn't have no success. Like, this was not a Bryce Young situation where there was no ability to get any kind of offensive rhythm going. This is kind of an up and down. And I think that it's one of those things, like, I remember when Brandon Cooks was traded to the Cowboys and became the first player to play for 4 teams to which he was traded. I did a story where it was like, why is this happening? Because you kind of want to be like, oh, he's not good enough. He's so good that people still want to trade for him, not sign him. And sometimes there's just a confluence of factors. And so with Baker Mayfield, for one, at the very end of his Cleveland tenure, he had a torn labrum. Yes, it was his non-throwing shoulder, but that did seem to impact him. And there was also just some maturity things, both on and off the field. I mean, this is a situation where, I think we've probably heard some of the off-field things. We don't need to relitigate Baker's off-field personality, particularly when he was younger. But I think on-field, too, some of the decision-making, some of the desire to take chances and take shots downfield that would have worked at the college level but really don't work in the NFL level. Some of the willingness to commit to working on the footwork, to becoming the right weight so that he can scramble effectively. Because as the Tampa Bay quarterbacks coach, Thad Lewis, told me this week, you don't have to run, but you do have to be able to scramble to play effectively in this league, in his opinion. And so I think we're now seeing this situation where Baker did settle down. He did kind of figure out what were his strengths, what were his weaknesses, how do you lean into his strengths? And I think it is a fascinating conversation for teams like a Carolina to say, is there a way for this guy to come back after it hasn't worked? What does it take? It's not going to be the same for every guy. And can you do it with this organization, or is a guy going to need a fresh start?
I think Jori just is doing this to pre-write her Bryce Young revival story for 2028. That's all.
Let's go.
There's a lesson here, obviously, and it's there should be patience with a lot of these guys. Baker Mayfield was not a zero with the Cleveland Browns. He had some good stretches of play, and they just gave up on him right away. And for many of the reasons Jori just talked about. And I get it, I understand, but just think of this. How much better off would that franchise be right now had they just stuck it out with Baker? Wouldn't have Deshaun Watson, wouldn't have this contract, wouldn't be the most unlikable team in sports because you have Deshaun Watson. You would be on a path of something a lot better, assuming Baker would have developed the way he did. And maybe he doesn't. Like, sometimes it's just your environment. Maybe he did need to hit rock bottom where he had to sign basically a bottom of the barrel deal with the Buccaneers just for one more chance to be a starting quarterback, and he took advantage of it. Maybe he needed that wake up call. Maybe Sam Darnold needed to get with some really, really good coaches in Kyle Shanahan last year, learn there, then be ready for Kevin O'Connell. But I just think there's lessons here in that this whole microwave approach to developing everybody. And if you're not good within a year, we're just throwing you out. Like, that's done. We're done with you already. That doesn't really always work with quarterbacks. It's hard to play in this league. It's not easy for everybody except for CJ Stroud and Jaden Daniels, I guess. Sometimes it's going to take time. Sometimes it's going to take years, but nobody has years anymore. And this goes all the way back to the ownership level of any coach who doesn't have 2 good years is getting fired. So if you're a coach, I get it. Like, if you're a coach and you have a Baker Mayfield, a Sam Darnold with the Jets, whoever it is, and he's not good within a couple of years, you're like, well, I can't stick it out with him. I'm going to get fired. I just need to do something. Like, I can't wait for Sam Darnold to develop here. So it goes all the way back to, we make fun of Jerry Jones when he's patient with his coaches or whoever, but it's probably the better option because you can develop things. You're not just in this window of 2 years where if you don't win, you're getting fired. And that affects quarterbacks. It affects everybody else. So I think the lesson here of Baker and anybody else, Sam Darnold, obviously too, is that some of these guys are just going to develop at different speeds. And at the team level, at the ownership level, you got to be willing to see it through with your coaches and your quarterbacks sometimes, because it's not always going to be CJ Stroud.
I think I agree with everything you said, except for the fact that maybe Cleveland should have stuck it out with Baker, because I was asking people about this week when I was doing the research for the story. And I think what someone told me is, yes, it's easy to say now as Baker is having success and Cleveland does not have a quarterback who's able to give them what they want, which again, no left tackle, no right tackle, no running back. I'm not saying Deshaun Watson is serviceable right now. I'm just saying I don't know that we can assess it with the current information so well. We can just assess that he's not an elite quarterback who is going to be Patrick Mahomes-like and not need anyone around him. I do think, though, that some of Baker's immaturity and some of the mistakes on and off the field that he was making in Cleveland, I don't know that he was going to come back from it there. And so while I don't know that the organization generally should move on from a quarterback, I do think that there are some elements of immaturity that if they manifest with an organization, then that's where you lose the ability to get the guy there. But not necessarily. And so I think that he kind of needed a fresh start. And that's one of the things I was asking some of the scouts I talked to this week is, a lot of scouts coming out did believe that Baker was immature, but was going to be able to get past it to end up being a solid starter at the league level. Maybe not elite, but they did think it didn't matter about his height. It didn't matter about some of the things. He had enough talent and he had enough confidence and swagger and all of that, that it was going to lead to a productive NFL career. And so then I was asking the scout, I'm like, but how do you know if that immaturity is something that they're going to work out in their first stop or if they're going to have later stops? Because if you think it's going to take a fresh start to get through that, then how can you tell your franchise, draft this guy, go through the growing pains with him, and then let someone else succeed? On the Bryce Young revival note, I will say, I think the best thing that Bryce Young has going for him is that both Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield went through Carolina and came out better afterward because of it. So if Bryce Young can get to the other side of the Carolina experience, there are other concerns about him, including his size. Again, like Baker, as guys were telling me, because when they were saying like, oh yeah, Baker is a shorter quarterback and he doesn't have necessarily like the arm of Russell Wilson or the athleticism of Kyler Murray, but he's figured out what works for him. And I'm like, well, you are describing to me a lot of how people are describing Bryce Young in terms of like, can you see in the pocket? Can you be comfortable in the pocket? I think a big difference between them is, one, their demeanors are like pretty polar opposite. And I do think that marriage, you kind of need this like unrealistic level of confidence to be able to succeed in that position, and particularly in that position if you're not the height of like some of these guys who are doing this. I also think that Baker is a lot thicker. Like, yes, he lost some weight, and his quarterback coach was telling me that as he had like a quarterback draw the other day, he called him Slim Bake, and he was like Big Bake wouldn't have been able to make this play last year, but Slim Bake is making it. But Slim Baker is still like 30, 40 pounds heavier than Bryce Young. And so I think that there is a degree of like, he has the thickness that maybe Bryce needs to bulk up a little bit.
And I think that that's very true. And the physical aspect of Bryce Young, that's a different story altogether. The one guy I'm thinking of as we talk about all this, and I swear I'm not just trying to rile Fitz up, is Will Levis. Because as we sit here right now, we would say Will Levis is just a lost cause. But Will Levis has had, I believe, 10 career starts, and we're already giving up. He's done. We know Will Levis has a lot of physical skills, and I think a lot about Geno Smith in this conversation. If you look at his time with the Jets, they gave up on him fast. Like, it was like, nope, you're done. We're not even giving you. I don't know how many starts he got, but it wasn't many. And then he just never got another chance again. And then has this really cool revival with Seattle. He played really well on Monday night. I think Geno's a pretty good quarterback. And now we look at Will Levis, and our Tennessee Titans aren't going to be patient with him. We could already see it about Callahan. They're already asking him, like, are you going to start Will Levis next week? And Callahan kind of has to say, well, yeah, he's my quarterback. We don't know what Will Levis is. He might be a guy who takes 4 years to really become what he's going to become in the NFL, but the Titans don't have time for that. They don't want to live through that. So what do you do in that situation? And we're going to see this situation happen a lot around the NFL, where if you're not a CJ Stroud, if you're not a Jaden Daniels, if you're not instantly a superstar, you wonder how many years do teams really give these guys? And the answer, more times than not, is not many. They're going to move on right away because they don't have time, because they're going to get fired if Will Levis keeps throwing interceptions.
I think part of this, though, comes down to, like, there's not one universal rule, right? Like, I talked to Baker at the Super Bowl and asked him what was different in Tampa Bay. And the answer is just stuck in my head ever since. And as he said clearly, he's like, all I have to do at Tampa is play football. There's no pressure anymore in my career for me to be a savior and for me to be this great. I don't have to do anything other than just go out and play, and I don't have to worry. And I think, we speak about the maturity issues. Like, that's the variable that isn't going to be the same from Baker to Bryce. Like, I continually have said this for years. If you'd have handed me $30 million fully guaranteed when I was 20 years old, I'd ended up in rehab and broke in 6 months, right? Like, there's just not every kid is well positioned to handle that level of money and that level of pressure and that level of platform. So if that's part of it, and then I would say to Jori, to your point that, even everybody acknowledges maybe it wouldn't have worked with the Browns. part of that is Baker's fault. Part of that is also Baker knew he was going into, like, that's the hard part of this. You go into these pressure cookers where you don't get any time. It changes the way some people process everything. And I'll use a music analogy to all of this because I remember so distinctly an interview years ago with Bono from U2. And Bono said it took U2 3 records to figure out who they were as a band. And he laughed in that interview and said, man, you don't even get 3 singles now in the music business. You get 1. And if it's not good, you don't get a second single. And his point was there'll never be another U2 because there'll never be the patience. Like, this isn't just a football problem. This is a societal problem. Like, we talk about owners wanting to win right away. Why do owners want to win right away? Because social media is something owners see. And they see fans absolutely destroy the team every time that they lose a game. I mean, you've got every fan base coming in and say, fire the bum if they start 1-4.
Do you think most owners see social media?
Owners hear everything. Owners hear everything.
Maybe they're told
you know Jerry hears everything.
I do know Jerry hears everything. I think he hears more than like a Mark Wilf of the Vikings type person would hear, Ziggy Wilf. But I also think that someone's telling them about it. I don't think they're like seeing social media directly. But I get what you're saying about the sentiment. I'm just trying to picture somebody
is in Amy Adams Strunk's ear. Like, somebody's in Amy Adams Strunk's ear. Somebody's in Mark Davis's ear. Somebody's in Robert Kraft's ear. Like, they hear all of these things about what, like,
except Shad Khan, because he's paying no attention whatsoever.
Yeah, well,
but anyway,
but that's the weird part of this is which came first, the chicken or the egg on all of it. Like, if you went to a fan base and said, hey, I think we might have the right guy, but in order to find out if we've got the right guy for the next 15 years, we're going to have to suck for the next 3 years, and we may or may not have that guy. That is so rare. Like, that's what the Bills did with Josh Allen. They shut out all the noise. They didn't care. And they slowly developed a quarterback that's now an annual MVP candidate, right? That's just rare. Most teams aren't willing to do that. Most fans aren't willing to wait through that. Most owners aren't willing to go through that. Like, I'm not sure who's responsible for the microwave society. And that's why I don't think it's fixable.
I mean, right now, the thing I'm railing about is people want to fire Mike McDaniel. People are like, Mike McDaniel needs to give up play calling. He's the reason. What are we talking about? What? Mike McDaniel's a really, really good NFL coach. I get he has not performed a miracle with Snoop Huntley or Skylar Thompson. I get that. I get Matt LaFleur did without his starting quarterback. But people really think just Mike McDaniel stinks as a coach and get rid of him because he's not doing great without Tua Tagovailoa? Like, this is just what it is. You are absolutely correct, Fitz. There's the social media era where everybody needs to be 16 steps ahead of everything and be like, Mike McDaniel's a bum. Like, what? What are we talking about? Mike McDaniel's a really, good NFL head coach.
It's also a first take era. Like, to Jory, to your point, Amy Adams may not be sitting around watching Twitter every day or X or whatever we're calling it now. But she is driving around the city that has, the sports talk radio people yelling about it. She is turning on the TV and hearing people say, terrible things about, like, they hear it.
We are piping inside coverage into the speakers of the buildings in which these team owners are working. Correct.
We just don't know where Shad Khan is. That's all. We try to find Shad Khan, but he's absentee. So
if we're piping inside coverage into the Titans practice facility, Will Levis is going to kick my ass the first time I walk in there, and that's probably
you're intimidating now, man. Will Levis might back down.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
Look, if he throws punches like he throws footballs, I'll be fine. Jory, I'm just throwing it. The one thing I'd say is there something to the fact that we've talked about Geno, Baker, Sam Darnold? Like, this has become an annual tradition of quarterbacks getting to a place where there's a reclamation tone to it, but also organizations finding that guy. Like, is there a lesson here for other teams?
Yeah, I think one lesson is if we are not going to stray away from the start your quarterback immediately, especially if you drafted him in the first round era, which does seem to be the era we're in, especially if you're not the Green Bay Packers who don't have one team owner telling you what to do, then I think we need to realize if that doesn't work, there is another chance. I think that there's not one reason why it doesn't work and not one way to get that next chance. But I do think that if guys had positive evals coming out of the draft, I think that we should kind of think of the big picture and not assume that because they don't immediately have success at that level of the NFL game, that they're never going to have it. I probably mentioned on this podcast before one of my favorite metaphors that Rams general manager Les Snead likes to use in our conversations, which is that when you're projecting a quarterback particularly, but really scouting, but quarterback particularly, you are saying based on how this quarterback performed at this level of the video game, how do I think they're going to perform at the next level of the video game? When the spacing is different, the windows are different, there's just a whole different thing that the quarterback particularly has to process when looking at the field. And there's usually a transition level of like, hey, there's a reason why there's a lot of other minor leagues in professional sports. Not everyone is just ready for the pros right away, particularly when you're having to read the defenses the way that quarterbacks are. And so I think that when guys don't make that transition immediately, we should consider, well, what's not working? How can that work? And again, I think in some ways, this is almost a defense for what Carolina did sitting Bryce Young, is that if he's not ready now, rather than try and ruin him forever, let's say, what can we do? How can we try and figure out what he needs? And I'm not saying Bryce Young is going to make it back. I don't think we know that. I hope for Bryce Young that he does. I hope for the Carolina Panthers. And as I've mentioned, I think there is some degree of sentiment, at least in the Panthers organization, that, hey, we already let Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield get away and end up having their resurgences. We'd rather Bryce have his resurgence here than somewhere else. But I do think that there is a greater tail to these quarterbacks' careers if teams are willing to say, maybe he's not our guy right now. That doesn't mean he's not ever going to be our guy.
All right. We're going to break down. We got power rankings next. We're going to let Frank and Jori fight. It's going to be, I thought only Frank and C-Rob fought, but Jori's come in with boxing gloves. We're going to fight about some power rankings. We'll do it when we come back. I spent the break figuring out how I would not get hit by Will Levis. If I walked into the facility, I'll just wear a Titans jersey. Then he won't be able to hit me at all. Now I got to figure out how to get you two to not fight each other. I'm just throwing shade relentlessly because Frank has put out his power rankings. We like to take this opportunity to let him defend some of these decisions. But namely, Frank, a little bit of a battle as we were getting ready for the show. We noticed that you've got some NFC East rankings that Jori may not agree with. You've got the Cowboys at 15 this week, the Commanders at 12, and the Eagles at 9. So you were saying if you were power ranking the NFC East right now, it would go 4-3-2-1. It would go Giants, Cowboys, Commanders, Eagles. You stand by that?
I do. It was honestly, this was one of the toughest things on Monday when I'm ranking these teams, was figuring out the NFC East. And you all know how much on board I am with my Commanders. But I think I feel weird. Now I'm being like, people, we need to back off of this Commanders love. All right. Like, this is a team that almost lost to the Giants at home. If Malik Neighbors catches a 4th-and-4 pass, they do beat the Commanders in Washington. This is a team that got blown out in week 1. I get they've looked great the last 2 weeks. Don't get me wrong. This is still a team that, if you're going by EPA per play, has the worst defense in the NFL. I don't know that we can, I saw people arguing the Commanders are only 30% to win the NFC East. It should be way, way higher than that. No. There's still a long way to go with my Washington Commanders here. As much as I want to take victory laps on them, I still think the Eagles are a better team. They've been banged up. They look like senioritis hit them in that last week 4 game because they knew the bye was coming up. They knew they were banged up. They mailed in that game. They're like, let's get to the bye week. We have no AJ Brown. We have no Davante Smith. We have no Lane Johnson. I still think the Eagles are the best team in that division. But then I guess you say, well, why can't you say the same about the Cowboys? Because they have that talent too. I just have more questions about the Cowboys, I guess, than I do a healthy Eagles team. Jori, how would you rank these 3 teams right now if you had to right now? If I gave you my, if I call it sick on Monday and you had to do power rankings, you have a different order?
Yeah, I think that you have often talked about your power rankings as if these teams were to match up at a neutral site, who's going to win. And to me, I think that right now, the Commanders would beat at least the Eagles, possibly the Cowboys too. I think that this Eagles team, yes, they have a lot of talent, particularly when AJ Brown and Devonta Smith are healthy. But I think that they're reeling a little bit. And we saw that when they were reeling last season, they did not recover. It wasn't that they didn't have the talent, but that organization gets out of sorts in some ways. And I think that it was interesting when I was talking to people for the Baker Mayfield story and I was asking what was working against the Eagles. One of the things that they were saying is that so many of these defenses now, when they're playing 2 safeties, giving that shell coverage, defenses aren't great at tackling and don't like to tackle. And so you're just throwing underneath and making them pay. And the Eagles were not tackling well. I think depending on the service, it's they missed somewhere in the 10 to 17 tackles range. So when I look at that and I look at what Jaden Daniels has done, and even though he's had a lot of the underneath passes, not exclusively, but a lot of them, I just don't trust that the Eagles defense is going to be able to stop Jaden Daniels right now. And while their offense has some luck, well, yeah, so did the Arizona Cardinals a couple weeks ago, and look how well that went in the 42-14 Washington win. So I don't know that Washington will be able to sustain this throughout the course of the season, but I do feel like right now, Washington would beat Philly on a neutral ground. I think Dallas has I think it's probably like, I don't know that Dallas is a better team than Philly, but I think they probably match up better with Washington right now. And they also just historically have done well. So I would probably say at this exact moment, Commanders, Cowboys, Eagles.
Wow. Eagles third. Wow. Let me ask you a question, because I think this is interesting to put it in this perspective. I want to ask each of you, who wins the NFC East? It's hard, right? Like,
yeah.
you don't want to say Commanders.
Oh, and also my other
Commanders.
thing is, like, Jalen Hurts has been turning the ball over a lot. Probably some of that is playing hero ball without his guys in there. But the Cowboys are really good at capitalizing on that. Like, they have a lot of issues. They can't stop the run, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe Saquon Barkley's just going to burn the Eagles when they get there. But I do think that if they can get a couple possessions back, that helps.
Okay, who wins the NFC East? Pick an NFC East winner for me.
The Cowboys won last year, right?
Cowboys won last year, 12 wins.
No one's repeated since, 2003, 2004, so I'm not picking someone to repeat again. I think the Commanders could steal it.
Wow.
I don't know that they're the best team, but I do think that if the other teams lose enough early, I do think the Commanders can steal it.
I would love to take the Cowboys.
Pick the Giants. Pick the Giants.
I was still high on the Cowboys coming into the season.
Is going to steal the NFC East.
Giants.
I would love that.
The Giants. We haven't even mentioned the Giants. We're like, oh,
are they still in the division?
I think the schedule is pretty favorable for Philly. The rest, I think Philly's still going to win this division. You look outside of their division and the games they have coming up. They got, the Browns, the Bengals, the Jags. Those are all winnable football games. They do have to go to Baltimore, but that's about it. They don't have to take on, the juggernauts. They don't have to take the Lions and the 49ers on. The Cowboys do. I think that's enough of a difference that right now I would give the Eagles the division. But I realized that part of that is also just confirmation bias because I thought the Eagles were going to be good coming into this year. And I keep watching the Commanders thing and thinking, well, this can't last all year long. I realized that's just... I realize the stupidity of it, Frank. I get it. Let's see. Before I bank on Jaden Daniels turning in a full season of this absolutely incredible play and juggernaut offense from everywhere. Also, the Commanders' defense, I'd like to see it another week or two before I really buy into anything from them.
Yeah, it's not a good defense. And as much as, trust me, I want the Commanders to win the division, BetMGM does not want me to have that Commanders division win. Let's say, I just can't see it with this defense. I thought the defense was going to be much better under Dan Quinn. I'll go with the Eagles too. In my question of who I think wins the NFC East, I had the Cowboys before the year. I've kind of flipped that because I just think Cowboys have some major issues. Like that Thursday night game against the Giants had me lower on the Cowboys. I've talked about that. They can't run the ball. They're banged up on defense. I don't think their defense is anywhere near as good without Dan Quinn. It's funny. Dan Quinn didn't improve the Commanders, but him leaving sure affected the Cowboys. I'll take the Eagles to win that division. I just don't think the Commanders can keep this up as much as I want it. And I talked about all summer how I like the Commanders. Look, Jaden's awesome. He's really, really fun, but there's still a lot of flaws with this Commanders team and that's one reason right now I get it. So to some people, it doesn't make logical sense. That's one reason I still have the Eagles ahead of the Commanders in my power rankings.
But when you look at what they did against Arizona, does that not give you, to shut down Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr., does that not give you any...
I just wonder if the Cardinals stink. I mean, what do we have?
They did against the Rams.
Yeah, but the Rams might be even worse. Like the Rams defense is absolutely horrible right now. That's the thing when you do these power rankings, you're like, you do the transitive property, right? Like A beat B, and B beat C, and C beat A. So who do we? I don't know if the Cardinals are any good. I just don't, and I don't think the Bengals that night were any good because they're so banged up on the defensive line that their defense was just incapable. But the Bengals had their way offensively. Offensively, the Bengals moved the ball just fine against the Commanders. So, and again, it wasn't that long ago, and the Giants should have beat the Commanders in Washington, and the Giants stink. So I don't know what to make of the Commanders yet. I just don't, as I sit here as somebody who made so many jokes about the Commanders and my love of them in the offseason, as I sit here after 4 weeks, they're 3-1 and I should be thrilled. And yet I'm sitting here saying, I don't know if this is really sustainable with that defense. And the cast around Jaden Daniels, what Jaden Daniels doing is so much more remarkable because you look at their cast and you're like, who's our number 2 receiver? These running backs, like Brian Robinson's off to a great start, and I love the story, but Brian Robinson, their offensive line is playing well, but wasn't supposed to be good. So I just wonder about the Commanders going forward if this is sustainable.
If you're the Commanders, would you want Davante Adams?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Yes. I think
yes,
I would always be, if I thought I had a chance at the playoffs.
Not just to say, will he make the offense better? But I think in the short, medium, and long term, it would make sense. And when this team has momentum, why not continue to pedal it?
Right. I would always take the player over the pick. I would always, why not?
not to dig back to Davante, but that also raises the point that if you're getting a second rounder for Davante from a team like Washington, you're not getting a top 10 pick in the second round, you don't think. And the Jets, like you're getting a pick at the end. You're getting a glorified third rounder for him because it's a team that's going to be picking at the end of, they would presume, at the end of the round. All the more reason it's not happening. I'm telling you, it's not happening. You brought the Vikings up from from number 4 to number 2. You got Minnesota at number 2.
I think it was almost like number 7 to number 2, but that was tough. The one, I'm going to ask you guys again, who would you have number 1? I put the Chiefs there. And I thought about the Vikings for a long time because if you're just looking at these 4 games, which I don't do, look, my power rankings aren't standings. I watch all these games for a reason. I study everything. I study the advanced stats. I rewatch these games during the week because I think it's more than just about your record. I do. But you have 2 4-0 teams. And the Vikings have been the best team just on those 4 games. If you're just watching 4 games and have no idea of the history of these teams or anything like that, you say the Vikings are better than the Chiefs. But we all know the Chiefs' history. Yes, they just did lose Rashee Rice, but I also didn't want to be like banging on the Chiefs every week because I do that a lot because I'm always like, how in the world are they going to do this? And then they do it. I had the Chiefs number 1, the Vikings number 2. Some people, I don't look at many other power rankings, but I did see one that had the Vikings much, much lower. I think 5th or something like that. And I don't know how you justify that. Who would you guys have had number 1? Would it even be somebody like the Lions, or would you just go Chiefs, or would you go Vikings?
The thing is, again, going back to your idea that who's going to win, I think if the Chiefs and Vikings play, the Vikings will look better, but the Chiefs will find a way to win at the end. So I still think they're going to win. Like, it's just going to be ugly. And especially if they play in the playoffs, I definitely think the Chiefs would win.
Here's the thing, Frank. If I, in a beautiful world, if I had Mike Tyson in his prime, standing right across from Frank Schwab, and I said, Frank, you got to bet on this game. Vikings, Chiefs, neutral field right now. And if you're bet wrong, Mike Tyson in his prime gets 1 free punch right at your face. Would you bet on the Vikings? All of a sudden. Yeah, would you bet on the Vikings or would you bet on the Chiefs? We both know you bet on the Chiefs. For that, you got one game, you bet on the Chiefs, right? Like
that's it. Yeah.
So yeah, the Chiefs are number 1 on my power, even though it doesn't make sense. Doesn't matter. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't matter that it doesn't look as good. I do think, though, the Vikings are creating, I'll keep hammering this point, between their defensive coordinator, their head coach, and the way they've got their quarterback playing with a team that's drafting really well right now. I think the Vikings are creating a very Chiefs-like environment with what they're doing. So I think, Flores is their Spags. I think, they've got this thing figured out.
No, he's not their Spags, because one of the best things about Spags is he isn't going anywhere. And I don't know. I think Brian Flores will try and go somewhere to be a head coach again, don't you?
If somebody interviews him and gives him a real shot, I don't know about that. The NFL, I'm not going to bring up all the history, but the NFL can sometimes not treat people fairly when they've seemingly wronged them. I will say this, that I don't want to gloss that over, George, because I totally disagree. I think when you have sued the league, now we're talking about owners, right? And so if we were together on a show, just doing a podcast, and we were looking at another producer to come in. No offense, Stone, we love you. And the first thing we hear about Stone, about our new
God's
producer,
work, and now we're trying to replace him. Speaking out of both sides of your mouth, Mr. Fitz.
We love Stone, but all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, "Hey, by the way, just so you know, Stone currently has a lawsuit out against C-Rob." Well, I don't want to work with that guy. Like that's a complication. I don't know. I'm just putting a real world dynamic to. So many people will say collusion, and I get that. No, this is simple. There are only 32 NFL owners, and they will always look out for each other first. So the thought that there's a lawsuit against the league for anything, and that person is going to get a head coaching job, I don't think it happens. I think as much as I think Brian Flores is deserving of being a head coach, I want to say that clearly and loudly. I think he should be a head coach in the league. I don't think there's any world where a bunch of owners are going to look around at somebody that has said the things and filed the lawsuits that he's done against the league, and then be like, "Yeah, no, I'm comfortable making him my head coach." No way. I think that's why he is the Spags. He's going to be the defensive coordinator, very well paid for the Vikings for the rest of his career.
I actually agree, because I just think NFL owners, they do things. It's not collusion, but it's that nod, wink, wink. We're all going to get on the yacht at the owners' meetings and glad hand each other. And thanks, Arthur Blank, for not trying to sign Lamar Jackson away from me. And hey, everybody, we're not going to sit and say not to sign Colin Kaepernick, okay? Like, nobody has said that. Although Colin Kaepernick, got that settlement out of that. NFL owners are just, they will put, like you said, first and foremost, they're not looking out for you, the fans. They're not looking out for the team, first of all. They're looking out for each other, first of all. That's been proven, or else Arthur Blank would have signed Lamar Jackson. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole again. But yes, we've seen instances in the past where owners will look out for each other before even the best interests of their teams. And that's why I wonder, Brian Flores deserves another shot. I think he's learned. And, yes, the Tua thing is working against him too. He did not handle Tua well, but I think he deserves another shot. And honestly, as I sit here, I don't think he's going to get another shot to be an NFL head coach because of all the reasons you just said.
All right, let's get to a Thursday night preview before we get out of here. Tampa Bay taking on Atlanta. It's actually a really good Thursday night game for once. Atlanta's a 1.5 point favorite. At this point, Frank has gotten 4 games right on Thursday Night Football. Jori and I got one. Baby. One got one. I mean, that missed kick in that Cowboys game really changed this. We went from 3-2 to 4-1 because of one missed kick from a guy that's,
everybody.
Like a guy that never misses.
Too.
So
never misses. Literally had never missed from 50 plus misses.
Atlanta's a 1.5 point favorite. Frank, it's just so we can figure out what we should pick. Who you got in this one?
Easy for me. Wrong team is favored here. Tampa Bay Buccaneers are by far the better team than the Atlanta Falcons. Falcons are really, really lucky to not be 0-4 right now. If Saquon Barkley catches a pass that he catches 95% of the time, and Koo doesn't make a field goal that he's never made before. His career log was 54. They tried him out for 58, and he somehow makes it. They also had a muff punt for a touchdown in that game and a pick six for Troy Anderson, their linebacker in that game. They got really lucky to win. I just don't think Atlanta's playing very well right now. Bijan Robinson is banged up. I think the Buccaneers are clearly the better team. I was shocked that the Falcons are favored in this game. I'll just say that. And Buccaneers all day, straight up. Give it whatever you want. The Buccaneers win this game.
Yeah, and Jori, I have my actual cash on Tampa Bay. I should I'm quick on this. I agree with Frank. I put my money on Tampa Bay in this game, which is not sexy. I'm still going to have a big deficit. So who you got?
It's so funny because I'm writing this Baker Mayfield resurgence story, and I'm dreading the fact when Jesse Bates just makes him look stupid because he's getting all of these picks, and the Atlanta defense is coming out to play, and Matt Judon and all of them are causing issues. So I will go Atlanta regrettably and probably be in last place in the standings because of it, but I'm willing to take that on. If anything, now I'll win one way or the other because either my story will bear fruit or I will win on the podcast.
And either way, we'll have a definitive person in last place by next week. That's amazing. All right, you can follow each of us on social media. Remember, if you've listened this far and you've never taken the time to rate, subscribe, review, we would genuinely appreciate it if you would. Makes a big difference for us. We appreciate it. Always, we thank Stone for not suing all of us and also for doing great work behind the scenes. We'll be back Friday with C-Rob. As always, tell your friends, your family, tell your enemies, tell everybody to hang out with us. We will see you Friday. Thanks for listening to the show.